In one of the economic powerhouses of the European Union, more than 1 million children live in conditions of absolute poverty. This is not a statistic from a distant past. It is the reality of today. We have already made another video where we talked about the countries with the highest rates of extreme poverty. In this video, we will analyse the official ranking of the 10 EU countries with the highest percentage of people at risk of poverty or social exclusion, revealing the causes and faces of this hidden crisis. And make sure to stay until the end, because we will show you which 5 nations have seen the situation worsen the most in the last decade. Here's a hint, some of them are not in this top 10. Welcome to Amazing Europe. Number 10. Germany. What if we told you that in the richest and most powerful country in Europe, nearly 18 million people, more than 1 in 5 citizens, are at risk of poverty or social exclusion? This is not a hypothesis, it is the shocking reality of Germany today. Germany has an enormous and growing income poverty rate. Millions of people, even though they have a roof over their heads and food to eat, do not have enough to live with dignity. Who are these people? They are the more than 7 million mini-jobbers trapped in low-wage contracts. They are almost a quarter of the elderly, especially women, whose pensions are no longer enough. And they are nearly 3 million children and young people growing up in at-risk families, with their future already compromised. For single-parent households, the danger of falling into poverty reaches a dramatic 43%. When people think of Germany, these individuals and their suffering are often unjustly forgotten. The main cause of this social divide has a precise date: the labour market reforms of the early 2000s. These political choices gave absolute priority to corporate competitiveness, creating the largest low-wage sector in Europe and sacrificing the security of millions of workers. All this has taken place in a context of a severe housing crisis that, in large cities, devours the lowest incomes. Moreover, Germany heavily taxes labour, especially middle and low-income earners, while imposing much lighter burdens on large fortunes, inheritances, and capital income, which fuels deep social inequalities. The result of this economic model is a nation where 21.1% of the population is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Number 9. Croatia. In 9th place in our ranking, we find the newest member of the Eurozone, Croatia. A country that, in the collective imagination, is synonymous with breathtaking coastlines and dream holidays. Yet, behind this facade, 21.7% of the population, almost 850,000 people, are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. To understand why, we must turn our backs to the sea and look inland. In fact, there are 2 Croatias. On one side, the prosperous coast that thrives on tourism. On the other, the forgotten interior, especially the region of Slavonia. Heavily affected by the War of Independence in the 1990s, this region, once the country's breadbasket, now suffers from deep depopulation and unemployment rates twice the national average. It is here that vulnerability explodes, especially among the elderly. 1 in 3 pensioners in Croatia is at risk of poverty, one of the highest figures in Europe. They survive in depopulated villages, living on minimal pensions. One of the causes of this divide is an economic model that has bet almost everything on a single card: tourism. Many of the workers who serve the millions of tourists on the coast are employed on seasonal contracts, with low wages and no protections, often working for only 6 months a year. For the rest of the year, they depend on minimal subsidies or undeclared work. This economic monoculture, combined with mass emigration that has drained the country's interior of its youth, has created a deep imbalance. A particularly affected group is children. 20% of them are at risk of poverty, a figure that rises sharply for single-parent households. The scars of war and a bureaucracy that slows the use of EU funds complete the picture. Number 8. Estonia. In 8th place, we find a country the world admires as a model of the future and innovation. Estonia, the first fully digital nation. Yet, in this technological paradise, a darker side is hidden. To understand poverty here, we must look at those left behind by the digital revolution. Vulnerability has 3 main faces. The first and most shocking is that of the elderly. Estonia has one of the highest rates of poverty risk for people over 65 in the entire European Union. Nearly 40% live below the poverty line, a figure even higher for single women. Their pensions have been virtually wiped out. The second face is that of the Russian-speaking minority, concentrated in the northeast of the country, a former industrial region left behind by the technological transition. The third and perhaps most affected group is single-parent families, whose poverty risk rate exceeds 30%. One of the causes of this deep social divide is, paradoxically, the very ultra-liberal economic model chosen by the country. Low taxes and minimal regulation have fueled growth, but at the cost of a very weak social safety net. To this structural fragility was added the perfect storm of post-pandemic inflation, which devastated the purchasing power of lower incomes. Just consider that in 2022, inflation in Estonia nearly reached 20%. It is the paradox of a nation projected toward the future, yet leaving behind those who cannot keep up with change. Here, according to official Eurostat data, 22.2% of the population is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Number 7. Italy. Hold on tight. In Italy, a G7 giant and the third largest economy in the Eurozone, more than 1,200,000 children live in absolute poverty. Not at risk, but absolute. This means their families cannot afford a basic basket of essential goods for a minimally acceptable standard of living. These are not our figures, but those of the Italian National Statistical Institute. How could such a social tragedy occur in the heart of Europe? The answer lies in a deep fragility that runs through the country. In addition to the crisis affecting children, Italy holds another sad European record, one of the highest percentages of NEETs, young people who neither study nor work, a generation suspended without prospects. Added to this is the historic and unresolved divide between a relatively wealthy north and a south, where the risk of poverty explodes, exceeding 40%. The causes are a tangled web accumulated over decades, a stagnant economy that has not grown for 20 years, paralysed by chronic political instability, a dual labour market that protects older workers but offers young people only precarious employment, massive tax evasion that drains nearly €100 billion a year from the state, resources that are missing from healthcare, education and welfare. And welfare itself, historically skewed toward pensions, has left families and children with insufficient support. This is also why Italy has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. Economic insecurity and the lack of effective state support for families make having children a luxury for many young people. Although in recent years Italy has made progress recognised across Europe, the wounds of the past remain extremely difficult to heal. Here, according to official Eurostat data, 23.1% of the population is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Number 6. Latvia. Imagine a country that, in just one generation, has lost more than a quarter of its population. This is not the plot of a movie, but the recent history of Latvia, the 6th nation in our ranking. It is a story that helps us understand why poverty here is so widespread and deep. Vulnerability in Latvia has a clear face, that of the elderly. The country has one of the highest poverty risk rates for people over 65 in the entire European Union, an incredible 45%, a figure that rises to over 50% for single women. But exclusion also strikes hard at the Russian-speaking minority, which still bears the scars of post-Soviet divisions. It also affects the inhabitants of the Latgal region, one of the poorest rural areas in the entire Union. The main cause of this situation is the scar left by the devastating financial crisis of 2008. To save itself from collapse, Latvia implemented a brutal cure, some of the harshest austerity policies in Europe, with drastic cuts to wages and public spending. This decision triggered a massive wave of emigration, emptying the country of its workforce and leaving behind the most vulnerable. It is the result of an economic shock that saved the state but sacrificed a generation. Here, according to official Eurostat data, 24.3% of the population is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Number 5. Lithuania. In Lithuania, Nearly 1 in 2 elderly women living alone is at risk of poverty. This is not just a statistic, it is a social failure of dramatic proportions in the heart of one of the Baltic tigers. In this country, post-Soviet economic success hides deep scars. Vulnerability in Lithuania is a storm that strikes with precision. It affects, as we have seen, the elderly, whose pensions are among the lowest in Europe. It affects single-parent families and children. It affects people with disabilities, who face enormous barriers. And it hits hard those living in rural areas, where the risk of poverty is almost 3 times higher than in cities, in villages emptied by a mass emigration that has seen nearly a quarter of the population leave the country since joining the EU. These fractures are the result of a shock therapy. After gaining independence from the Soviet Union, Lithuania embraced a rapid transition to a market economy. This brought growth, but also dismantled the previous social and industrial safety nets, leaving many people without protection. It also deepened inequality. Lithuania has one of the highest income gaps in the entire Union. The richest 20% of the population earns 6.4 times more than the poorest 20%. It is a divide that has created 2 parallel societies, one urban and connected to Europe, and one rural and elderly, left struggling to survive. It is the story of a divided nation where prosperity is not for everyone. Here, according to official Eurostat data, 25.8% of the population is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Number 4. Spain. Spain's youth tragedy can be measured in 2 ways. The first is the 28% unemployment rate, which tells us that almost 1 in 3 young people knocking on the labour market's door finds it slammed in their face. But there is an even sadder figure, that of the NEETs. 12.7% of young Spaniards not only do not work, but have also stopped studying or even looking for a job. They are young people adrift, excluded from any path forward. Together, these 2 figures paint the portrait of a sacrificed generation. The condition of young people is the heart of Spain's social drama. Those who do find work often have temporary contracts, trapped in a limbo of instability that makes it impossible to plan their lives. The direct consequence is devastating child poverty. Nearly 28% of Spanish minors grow up at risk, a figure that explodes to over 50% for single-parent families. The causes lie in the unhealed scars of the terrible financial crisis of 2008. Instead of reforming a fragile economic model based on tourism and low-cost services, the response was to implement policies that made work more precarious. This created a dual and unfair system that protects older workers but offers young people and immigrants only insecurity. Added to this is a fierce housing crisis that, in major cities, devours the lowest wages, driven by speculation and short-term tourist rentals. It is the story of a broken social elevator, where children know they will live worse than their parents. Here, according to official Eurostat data, 25.8% of the population, nearly 12.5 million people, is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Number 3. Greece. In Greece, nearly 500,000 of the most qualified young people, doctors, engineers, researchers, have left the country over the past decade. It is a brain drain of biblical proportions, a symptom of a nation where the future has been sacrificed. This hemorrhage of talent is the direct consequence of a crisis that has hit the younger generations hardest. With a youth unemployment rate that constantly exceeds 20%, one of the highest in Europe, young Greeks face a labour market that offers little more than precarious or seasonal jobs in the tourism sector. But vulnerability runs through the entire society. Nearly 23% of children grow up at risk of poverty, and the elderly, once the pillars of Greek families, have seen their pensions cut by an average of more than 25%. The main cause of this social devastation has a name: austerity. To obtain international loans during the debt crisis, Greece was forced to undergo an unprecedented economic shock. Brutal cuts to wages and pensions, massive tax hikes, and the dismantling of the public health system. It was a social experiment that deliberately destroyed the country's middle class, the true engine of every healthy society, leaving behind a nation more unequal than before. It is the story of how a financial crisis turned into a social one. Here, according to official Eurostat data, an astonishing 26.9% of the population, nearly 2.8 million people, is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Number 2. Romania. In Romania, almost 1 in 3 children, over 1 million, grows up at risk of poverty or social exclusion. It is one of the most severe cases of child poverty in the entire European Union, a hidden human emergency behind triumphant headlines about economic growth. This is not just a statistic, it is a tragedy that takes a dramatic form with the children left behind. Nearly 74,000 grow up without either parent, both having emigrated abroad for work. This vulnerability is rooted in a deep geographical divide. Half of Romania's rural population lives at risk of poverty, often in villages lacking basic infrastructure such as running water and paved roads. This condition disproportionately affects the Roma community. In fact, it is estimated that about 70% of the Roma population in Romania lives below the poverty line, often in segregated settlements without access to essential services. The causes form a lethal web that suffocates the country's potential. Endemic corruption, which according to international indexes is among the highest in Europe, an uneven pattern of economic development, with a few technological hubs such as Bucharest and Cluj, surrounded by a vast rural desert. And mass emigration which, after EU accession, drained the nation of more than 4 million citizens, leaving villages without doctors and without a future. All this unfolds in a context of extreme inequality, making Romania one of the most unequal countries in the Union. The result is a cruel paradox, an eastern tiger unable to feed its own children. Here, according to official Eurostat data, 27.9% of the population is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Before revealing number 1 and showing which nations have actually seen their poverty rates increase over the last 10 years, if you found this video informative, we kindly ask you to support our project by giving a like, subscribing to the channel, and clicking the bell icon so you don't miss our next videos. And don't forget our new channel, America vs. Europe, where we compare all European countries, the United States and Canada across a wide range of topics. Number 1. Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, nearly 40% of people over the age of 65 are at risk of poverty. It is one of the highest rates in the entire European Union. For hundreds of thousands of elderly citizens, this translates into an inhuman choice during the long winters, paying heating bills or buying food. Their pensions, the lowest in Europe, simply are not enough for both. But this extreme vulnerability does not stop with the elderly. It is a scar that runs through the entire society. It affects almost 26% of children, is concentrated dramatically within the Roma community, and devastates the rural areas of the northwest, one of the poorest regions on the entire continent. The causes form a vicious circle that is almost impossible to escape. First among them is endemic corruption. According to Transparency International, Bulgaria is perceived as the most corrupt country in the EU, a cancer that drains vital resources. Added to this is a low productivity economy, which produces the lowest wages in Europe, and a mass emigration that has caused a true demographic collapse. Over the past 30 years, the country has lost nearly 1/3 of its population. And all this happens in the most unequal nation in the Union. The richest 20% of the population has an income 6.6 times higher than that of the poorest 20%. It is not just a gap, it is a social abyss. The lethal combination of these factors explains why Bulgaria stands at the top of this tragic ranking. Here, according to official Eurostat data, 30.3% of the population is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. However, it must also be acknowledged that Bulgaria has greatly improved in recent years. In 2015, this percentage stood at 43.3%. In fact, almost every EU nation has improved, except 5. In 5 countries, there has been total stagnation or even worsening over the last 10 years. Austria is a nation where the percentage of people at risk of poverty or social exclusion has remained unchanged, staying stable at 16.9%. In this ranking, we have already seen Germany, which is now at 21.1%, but 10 years ago it was at 20.8%. Slovakia has also worsened, and paradoxically, so has Luxembourg, a very rich nation where not everyone manages to keep up. But the EU country that has undoubtedly experienced the largest increase in poverty is France. This worsening has mainly affected those who once felt safe: low and middle-income workers, young people, and students. The poverty rate among 18 to 29-year-olds now exceeds 21%, forcing many to rely on food banks. Analysts say this social erosion has been accelerated by political reforms implemented in recent years that have weakened protections for the most vulnerable, such as those that made unemployment benefits stricter and raised the retirement age. Added to this is an unrelenting housing crisis that consumes the lowest wages. And it is precisely this housing crisis that we explore in the video you see here, where we reveal the 10 European countries currently experiencing the worst real estate crisis. We recommend watching it to get a more complete picture of the situation. That's all for this video. See you next time.